What if Henry VIII had fully embraced Mary as his heir from the very beginning? Would England have had its first official queen regnant decades earlier? And could it have changed the course of Tudor history? Today, I'm diving into this fascinating alternate history scenario. We'll explore what actually happened to Mary, why Henry never truly accepted her as his successor, and what might have been different if he had. Could a Tudor-Stuart alliance have united England and Scotland sooner? Would the English Civil War have played out differently? And was the world ready for a female monarch at that time? Let's explore the possibilities and uncover how different history might have been. Thank you to Heather for this week's question. Heather's exact question was, what would have happened to Mary if Henry VIII had declared her to be his heir from the get-go? If he'd embraced the idea of having a female heir once it became clear Catherine couldn't have had a son, how could things have turned out differently? And is there a possibility that Mary could ever have married her cousin James V? It's an interesting what if, and I do love what ifing. Mary was Henry VIII's eldest child and was born to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the king's first wife, on the 18th of February 1516. She was their only child to survive infancy, and so for many years was Henry VIII's heir. He doted on her, referring to her as his pearl of the world. However, at the time, women were seen as incapable of ruling. Try telling that to Mary's maternal grandmother, Isabella of Castile, or Mary herself later. And Henry expected her birth to be followed at some point by that of a healthy son, a Prince of Wales. Mary's use lay in diplomacy, in marrying her off to some foreign prince or king as part of the terms of an alliance. And when she was just 2, a betrothal was arranged between Mary and the infant Dauphin of France. Mary's biographer Melita Thomas notes that as part of the treaty with France, Henry was obliged to recognise Mary as his heir, which Henry didn't mind doing as Catherine was heavily pregnant, and she was sure to give him a living son, wasn't she? Well, no. She gave birth prematurely to a daughter who was either stillborn or didn't survive long. It was Catherine's last pregnancy. Mary was still the king's only legitimate child, and Henry soon went off the idea of Mary marrying the Dauphin. If Mary did inherit the throne, then her husband, who might well be King of France by that time, would take control. So when Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, put forward the idea of Henry breaking the French treaty and marrying Mary off to him, Henry was ready to listen. Again, Henry had to agree to Mary being the heir to his throne, unless he had a son, which ran the risk of England being swallowed up by the Empire and being just another of Charles V's territories. But Charles dangled a very enticing carrot in front of the king. He'd help him take France. In 1522, the marriage was agreed, but Mary was only 6 and so couldn't marry the emperor yet. Unfortunately, in 1526, Charles, who was in desperate need of money, went on to break the arrangement by marrying Isabella of Portugal for her dowry instead. He just couldn't wait for Mary. In the meantime, in 1525, Mary, as Henry VIII's heir, was sent to Ludlow to preside over the Council of the Marches. This was the usual role for the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales. But although Mary was sometimes referred to as the Princess of Wales, her father never actually raised her to that status. While she was in the Marches, Henry negotiated once more with France for Mary to marry the widowed French king Francis I. But Henry was against the idea of 12-year-old Mary going to France, or the idea of her visiting France so that Francis could quickly consummate the marriage to make it legal and binding. Negotiations still went ahead, and in 1527 Mary was brought back to court, having spent just 19 months in the Marches. The Treaty of Westminster was agreed, with Henry promising Mary in marriage to Francis or his second son, the Duke of Orleans. But then things changed. That summer, Henry VIII applied to the Pope for a dispensation to marry one of Mary's mother's maids of honour, Anne Boleyn. Catherine of Aragon's opposition to the annulment of her marriage led to her being banished from court and her daughter, who stood by her, falling out of favour and eventually losing her title of princess and her legitimacy. She went from being her father's pearl in the world to having members of her father's council tell her she was a traitor and should be punished as such, and having her life threatened. Her household ended up being combined with that of her younger half-sister Elizabeth, who was now heir to the throne. Mary wasn't welcome at court again until the summer of 1536, after she'd submitted to her father and accepted the annulment of her parents' marriage, her illegitimate status, and her father's position as supreme head of the church in England. It cost her dearly. But following her rehabilitation, her father was once more open to marriage negotiations for Mary, and between 1536 and the end of Henry VIII's reign, potential bridegrooms included Henry of Orleans, Dom Luis of Portugal, who was her cousin as the son of Catherine of Aragon's sister Maria, William, Duke of Cleves, who was the brother of Anne of Cleves, Duke Philip of Bavaria, and King James V of Scotland, who was Mary's cousin, being the son of Margaret Tudor. Melita Thomas also adds the Lord of Transylvania to the list. However, with her illegitimate status, Mary wasn't much of a catch for these men, and with Henry VIII unwilling to change her status, the negotiations always fell through. Mary remained unmarried until 1554, after she'd become queen, marrying Philip of Spain, son of her former fiancé, Charles V. So that's what happened to Mary, and as you can see, Mary was treated as Henry VIII's heir for a time from the get-go. He recognised her as his heir and made treaties based on that. But at that time, he was hopeful that a son would come and never believed that Mary was going to remain his heir. It was always temporary. It's hard to know whether Mary was sent to the Marches because Henry was coming round to the idea that she could be queen, or whether it was just to pacify Catherine of Aragon after he'd raised his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, to the peerage, giving him a double dukedom. And many saw that as a sign that the king would make the boy legitimate and his heir. Catherine of Aragon knew that a woman could rule, her mother had, but the English people were very different. Their ideas about women being the feeble sex and the man being the dominant one made them resistant to the idea of a queen regnant. Personally, I don't think Henry was ever willing to permanently accept a female ruler. Even when he named Mary and Elizabeth in his 1543 Third Succession Act, it was only after Edward. His daughters were only ever second best options. If Henry had truly embraced the idea of a queen regnant, England's entire political and social framework might have had to shift decades earlier than it actually did. Had Henry truly accepted Mary as his heir long term, would he have trained her more seriously for rule? Would she have played a larger role in court and spent longer learning how to govern in the Marches, perhaps resulting in a stronger, more politically adept queen by the time she took the throne? Well, I don't see that as happening unless Edward was never born. And even then, the king would have kept trying for a son, and Mary would still have been seen as only good for diplomacy. And a marriage was considered between Mary and James V of Scotland. What would have happened if she'd married James? Well, like her aunt before her, Mary would have travelled to Scotland to marry the king. It's impossible to know whether they would have had any children before his death in 1542, but if they had, then I'm sure Mary would have acted as regent until the child came of age, similar to what happened when the infant Mary, Queen of Scots, became queen on James's death. If he'd been married to Mary, would James have still gone to war with Henry VIII in 1542? Well, England had still gone to war with Scotland in 1513 when Margaret Tudor was married to King James IV. Personal feelings and relationships didn't seem to come into it. But if peace had won out, then perhaps James wouldn't have become ill and died in 1542. Edward VI would still have come to the throne of England in 1547. But what would have happened when he died in 1553? Would Mary have still laid claim to the throne of England? Yes, I expect so, and she'd have had Scotland on her side. Perhaps she would have been regent for a son even, a king of Scotland, and perhaps that son would have laid claim to England, uniting the two kingdoms in 1553. It's a possibility. And that son would have had an even stronger claim to both thrones than James VI did in 1603, being the son of the heir to the English throne as stipulated by Henry VIII in his will. But then again, England might have resisted unification, although it may not have been able to fight off Scotland and its old ally France. And what would have happened if the Tudors and Stuarts united earlier? Would the English Civil War have happened as we know it? Perhaps a Catholic-descended Tudor-Stuart monarch in 1553 would have altered the religious landscape entirely. I think my brain might actually explode from all of this what-ifing. So what if Henry VIII had truly embraced the idea of a queen regnant? While Mary was treated as heir at times, her position was always uncertain, and Henry never fully committed to the idea of female succession. If he had, England's history might have looked very different, perhaps even avoiding the later succession struggles that shaped the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. There are so many possibilities, and I've definitely missed out some factors, so please do share your views on this alternate history and its impact. Oh, and I highly recommend The King's Pearl by Melita Thomas and also Linda Porter's biography of Mary if you want to know more about her. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into Tudor what-ifs, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the notification bell for more history explorations. Thank you for watching and I'll see you next time.